Good morning, members. It's already time to start the meeting. We have also formed a quorum. Maybe the deputations can be invited to join us as well. They haven't arrived. Let's get the administration to join us first.
Susan.
Good morning. I would like to welcome the officials for joining our meeting. For today's meeting, we have got two items. First of all, let's have a discussion about the legislation on inclusive education in Taiwan, the UK, and the US. Earlier on, we have invited the Research Office of the Legislative Secretariat to prepare an information note on the topic. In a moment, I'm going to invite the colleagues from the Research Division to give us a briefing. The second item is on the provision of individual education plans for students with special educational needs. Deputations will join us for the third item on the agenda. So first of all, legislation on inclusive education. Sorry, we need to confirm the minutes. Thanks for reminding me. We have to confirm the minutes of the previous meeting. Members, concerning the minutes of the previous meeting, any comments? No? Then minutes confirmed. Now we are on the second item on the agenda, and it's about the legislation on inclusive education in Taiwan, the UK, and the US. Ms. Hun, Dr. Hun, please give us a briefing. Thank you, Chair. We are not going to give you the details concerning the practices in Taiwan, the UK, and the US. I just want to briefly talk about the similarities and differences between the three places in Hong Kong. For those three places, they have differences in their specific arrangements. They emphasize early identification, early intervention, and also removal of discrimination. Parent involvement is also important. In Hong Kong, we haven't got legislation on integrated education for SEN children, but then the policy of the Hong Kong government is moving broadly in this direction. I think we can spot three major differences between the three places in Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, we have integrated education. In Taiwan, the US, and the UK, they have inclusive education. For the two approaches, the arrangements are similar. Students with SEN will be sent to ordinary or mainstream schools for their learning. But then there are differences in the features. For integrated education, it means that students with SEN will be helped to adapt to the school arrangements. For inclusive education, the direction is different. In other words, it emphasizes the arrangements to equip the school environment to fit the needs of the SEN students. As a result of the differences in the approach, the schools in Taiwan, the UK, and the US have a statutory policy to remove the barriers to learning and participation that can hinder or exclude students with SEN. Therefore, in terms of software and hardware, they have to make adaptations and adjustments. Say, for example, physical facilities in the schools and also their teaching methods must be adapted so as to cater for the needs of students with SEN. In Hong Kong, we haven't got such mandatory requirements. In Hong Kong, the Education Bureau has got this whole school approach, and we have a 3-tier support model, so that students with SEN will be given individualized assistance. In relation to IEP, Individual Education Plan, it is for the 3rd-tier support. In other words, only students with severe learning difficulties are entitled to Tier 3 support and IEP. In Taiwan and the US, in fact, their law says that IEP must be given to all students with SEN. In other words, it is a statutory entitlement. In the UK, the current law doesn't mandate IEP on schools, but then schools are advised to do it, and in fact schools have the duty to take care of the individual needs of each SEN student. Children and Families Act 2014 will come into effect on the 1st of September this year. At that time, each SEN student will be provided with a tailor-made education, health and care plan. This embraces even more sectors, that is embracing education, health services and social care provisions. That's all from me. Thank you, Dr. Hyun. It is very succinct, and you have compared the legislation in the 3 places as well as the arrangements in Hong Kong. I would like to give the floor to Mr. Ye, the Undersecretary for Education, to give us a briefing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We are grateful to the Legislative Secretariat for preparing the information note. I think the information is very useful. In Hong Kong, we haven't got legislation for inclusive education or integrated education. We haven't got the legislation, but I think the approaches adopted reflect the philosophy of the different places. In the case of the UK, they have made some adjustments to their approach. Now they are having a plan to take care of education, health services, and even a career. So in fact, the different places do vary in terms of their arrangements, perhaps taking into account their political setup as well as their different thinking. To us, we believe that despite the fact that we haven't got legislation to that effect, but basically I think we are doing the same. Early identification, early intervention, whole school approach, and we have also made arrangements to adapt the physical facilities of schools. Just now, we were told about the difference between integrated education and inclusive education. I think the difference is the name only. In the past, we did have the term special education. Now we've moved over to integrated education, but it doesn't mean that we're going to change the students so that the student can fit into the school. What we are talking about is that we provide facilities within the school, and in terms of the curriculum, we try to help the students to adapt to the school. I think integrated education and inclusive education are not exclusive of each other. It is sort of within the same spectrum. So the emphasis may be different. I think inclusive education in its full sense may be the sort of ideal that we are working towards. Probably currently we are sort of still approaching the final goal. But what is important is that it should be student oriented. if we are to take a closer look of the features of the different places discussed here, for IEP, under our system, we say that we must give it to the student as part of the Tier 3 support. But some schools also provide an IEP even for students in the first tier or second tier of the intervention model. As to the corresponding arrangements in those three places, perhaps we have to sort of look at the finer details in the technical sense, that is how they sort of categorize the students, whether they are the same as ours. And we are interested to know about the effectiveness as well as the outcome of having such legislation vis-a-vis our progress. All along, we have been reading up the literature. We have observed the pros and cons of legislation. In some places, the duty to have an IEP has resulted in mere formalities. Sometimes the IEPs may not be individualized enough, though we can be very individualized in Hong Kong. Sometimes in some places there is one single IEP for the entire class. So whether it is better to have legislation or not, I think we still have to look at the outcome of the policies and whether the original objectives can be achieved. This is my initial response, and I'm happy to listen to members' comments. Just now, the Research Division of the Legislative Secretariat has briefly told us about the legislation on inclusive education in Taiwan, the US, and the UK, and we were given a brief comparison with the arrangements in Hong Kong. Members, if you have questions, you can put them to Dr. Huynh from the Research Division.
We can also ask questions of those colleagues who have helped with producing this comparison. And of course, questions for Mr. Young, the Undersecretary, are also welcome. Just now, Mr. Young, the Undersecretary, said that Hong Kong might be in between the two ends of the same spectrum. The other three jurisdictions use the word inclusive while we use special. Mr. Young said that an SEN student would be assisted to adapt to the environment of a mainstream school in terms of learning and teaching. Inclusive education aims at changing the school environment such that the school environment will not create any learning hurdles for the students with special needs. So the first approach is to help the student adapt to the school environment, while the inclusive education approach is to change the school environment so as to assist the students concerned. Of course, in terms of both hardware and software, we're going to assist such students. So these are the two ends of the same spectrum. Pedagogy will still be worked upon, and you mentioned the 3 tiers of support. So I'd like to know the present situation. You have not been able to provide us with some basic information. For example, in the present budget exercise, I asked for the number of students for all the 3 tiers. Well, the total number is 30,000 odd, but how many for each tier? And how many IEP students do we have at the moment? Now, I'm asking for a simple picture. I'd like to know roughly how many ASEAN students we have for the 3 tiers. That is, how many students are being served in each of the 3 tiers. Your excuse is, well, you can give us an answer. Your excuse was that these students keep changing all the time. A student may change from tier 1 to tier 2 and then to tier 3. And a student may sometimes need IEP, but sometimes the student may not need an IEP. I just want to know the basic picture. Your responses have not been acceptable. Perhaps I should defer to my colleagues later for the details. If you ask us for the details of Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3, I'd like to say that in terms of categorization, we've always been trying to conduct assessments in order to produce a full picture. Well, if a student enters a classroom and we know that the student has special education needs, say, if we don't know the background of that student has not been studying for several years, normally we'll consider a student suitable for a normal classroom. But upon knowing that this student has special needs, we'll see whether or not he'll get adapted to the classroom. If after some time we discover that he cannot catch up with learning, then we'll proceed to Tier 2. There'll be remedial lessons for him, say, in a group. So he'll go to Tier 2. Failing that, we may have to proceed to Tier 3. That is the individualization approach. That is, we have to conduct an IET. But after some time, he may be able to go back to Tier 2 when his learning abilities have improved. So we'll continue to do IEP depending on the prevailing assessment of the school. So the message I'd like to get across is that it is very difficult to define how many students do we have in each of the 3 tiers. There may be difficulties, but if you ask me for resources, we can provide you with the information for each of the 3 tiers in terms of resources. However, for the exact number of students in each tier, there may be difficulties. Our approach is different from a statutory approach. There may be pros and cons. Under our approach, there will be flexibility. We make decisions on the basis of the learning abilities of the student concerned. If a student is good at a particular subject, he will join the normal classroom for that subject. We don't even have to provide remedial lessons for him. But for other subjects, we may have to take that student out for special support. So, the so-called exact number of students may not be able to reflect the real situation. Mr. Yang, Undersecretary, I'm not asking for very exact figures. Within a particular period of time, you actually know the funding level for each of the 3 tiers. So you have a clear picture for yourself. Of course, it is impossible for you to tell us at which juncture the exact number of such students, but you know the funding level for all the 3 tiers. In Taiwan and the USA, they've legislated to the effect that each ASEAN student will have an IEP, an individual education plan. This is just like a contract to safeguard the educational needs of the students. Under that plan, parents can participate, schools, parents, and students are engaged in a tripartite contract so as to make future arrangements for the students concerned in terms of learning and teaching. In Hong Kong, we're actually supporting our ASEAN students as well. We want to know how many ASEAN students are being supported, how many are not receiving any support. You said that in the UK, in future, they'll also legislate to that effect, going beyond learning and teaching, because health services and care services will also be covered. So if you cannot give me the number of students in each of the 3 tiers, then we won't be able to compare our 3-tier system with the systems adopted by other jurisdictions. Maybe we are very different from them. You should give us the information later. Well, in hand, I don't have the information. If you're asking for the information for comparison purposes, that may be misleading. In our system, we do not think that each and every ASEAN student need an IEP. If you want to know the percentage of students with IEP, I can say that we won't be able to compare ourselves with other jurisdictions. You cannot say whether or not the level of support is higher or lower, because that's unfair. We have to know the individual learning situation of a particular student. As you said, there are multi-party contracts in other jurisdictions. In some jurisdictions, they spent too much resources on the formulation of contracts, so to speak, or agreements, thus wasting the time of parents, teachers, experts, etc. These parties spent a lot of time to sit down and work out the arrangements on various fronts without being able to provide real help to the students. Under our approach, we'll assess the needs of the student concerned. Where there is a need, we'll provide support. Otherwise, support won't be necessary. So to a certain extent, we do not subscribe to the approaches adopted by other jurisdictions. I can go back and examine the issue further. Well, please go back to dig out statistics for us and also explain how you arrived at those statistics. Our IEP proportions may not be able to compare with those of other jurisdictions. You mentioned difficulties. You also said that not every jurisdiction, not every student need an IEP. So please give us the rationale behind your arguments as well. Mr. Tam Yu Chung, in Hong Kong, we call it integrated education. In Taiwan, the UK, and the United States, they call it inclusive education. They even legislate on that. Anyway, we're not attaching importance to the format. The most important point is that we'll be able to assist the ASEAN students. That's most important. And we would like to provide substantive help to these students. In order to do so, we'll have to look at the actual situation of each and every student. If we focus too much on format, it may not be helpful. If we discover that a student needs special help, then we should start from there and try to do our job well. If we don't provide special help, then teachers will also encounter problems. Both teachers and students may need help before they can perform well in education. After taking reference from the practices elsewhere, I still believe that it may not be necessary for us to legislate in order for us to perform well. The most important aspect is dedication. We must be dedicated to doing the job well. Do you need any response from the Bureau? No. Mr. Leung Yiu-chung. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't think we want to discuss abstract issues in an abstract manner. I think all of us want to do something for the students. So the most important point is to provide substantive and actual assistance to these students. Whether you call it inclusive or integrated, the crux of the matter is to provide substantive assistance to these students. Maybe they can respond to this in a moment. And another important aspect is parental engagement. Inclusive education covers more than integrated education. At the moment, in the Hong Kong system, there's only very, very little parental engagement. Sometimes parents don't want to say too much on the subject. Otherwise, the relationship with the children may be very poor. Sometimes schools turn a deaf ear to parents' remarks. Sometimes the attitude of schools is very poor. So sometimes parents may want to change school for their children. I have numerous examples. So, don't discuss abstract terminology, because terminology involves substance. So for inclusive education, if you want to legislate on that, you have to study the respective role of individual stakeholders. Now, our stakeholders don't have statutory status, so we cannot provide substantive help to SEN students. So if in Hong Kong we're to legislate, the government will also be a stakeholder. We have to assist the SEN students. So manpower have to be provided. What does that include? Not just trained teachers, but also experts. For example, psychologists, speech therapists, and so forth. Now look at this table. It's very clear. In other jurisdictions, the ratio of one expert to how many students? In Hong Kong, one expert to how many students? You see the differences. So, for their legislative approach, they get much more resources than we. So I'm not discussing this subject in an abstract manner. I agree that they've been adopting the approach for many years. They're very experienced and we're only starting very slowly.
We don't have to start from scratch. Others have already made a lot of progress, and we can start on such a basis, and it can save us time. And we don't have to waste time on abortive arrangements. So we really have to take the matter seriously and consider the case for legislation. Just now, Mr. Yang asked us whether it would be good to have legislation. You were saying that sometimes people only paid lip service to inclusive education, say, for example, one single IEP for the entire class. I just want to say this. We have legislation to disallow stealing, robbery, etc. Do we still have theft and robbery? Of course it is. By IEP and by having legislation, it doesn't mean that we expect all schools to be doing their best. But then if we haven't got a piece of legislation, we can force schools to do anything. So it's up to schools to exercise their own autonomy to say yes or no, because it is entirely school-based and they have the final say. By passing a piece of legislation, we can make it statutory and it will be mandatory. You tried to dismiss the case for legislation by saying that some people may only be half-hearted in complying with the legislative requirements. Yes, this is true. But then when compared with inclusive education, you have to tell us how our integrated education is different from inclusive education. Dr. Huynh, you need to be concise because we have to move on to the second item, and it is about IEP and is closely related to the one we are having a discussion. Dr. Huynh, for inclusive education, parental engagement is very important. Other than parental engagement, there is also this other requirement concerning communication. For a barrier-free environment, we don't just talk about the physical environment. We are also talking about barrier-free communication and free flow of information. So if parents haven't got the information, it will be difficult for them to make a decision. Therefore, for inclusive education, emphasis is placed on parental participation, and also both parents and students will get support in the form of all sorts of information. It will form a very important element of inclusive education. I think, relatively speaking, our approach is weaker in this sense. Yes, in other words, we want to make it more transparent. Mr. Chang, and then we will go into the final item on the agenda. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm grateful to Dr. Huynh for preparing the detailed information. I try to take a look at points 1.3 and 1.4. I think you have already pointed out the differences between integrated education and inclusive education. In Hong Kong, we expect the ASEAN students to fit into our system, so their individual circumstances will be overlooked. We try to resort to different equipment and facilities to ask them to fit into the overall environment. But in the overseas approach, the environment has to fit the needs of the ASEAN students, so they do respect the individuals. So the entire society is undergoing integrated education. So the majority members of the majority of the community members are asked to fit into the needs of the minority, namely the ASEAN students, so that the students can achieve their potential. So that's the first difference. And then just now, Mr. Yang and the Secretary talked about the negative effects of having legislation. I just want to tell you that with the legislation, no one is willing to do anything at all. It's only when you come into contact with students with SEN, then you would know that your work is meaningful. But then currently, I think people are trying to dodge the issue. So once legislation is passed, then it is imposed on them, and then they will find out about the meaning of such work. We are only making a start, so we shouldn't force the administration to come up with so much information. Now, who is entitled to an IEP? Even if 100 out of 10,000 SEN students have IEP, please justify and please tell us about the criteria, because we're interested to know. For the SEN students, if you take the approach of IEP, I want to note about the classification system, not according to their type of disabilities, rather the degree of learning ability. So I want to know how to cut off. Probably you have a few more categories before someone would become a person having an entitlement to IEP. It is important so that we can have an idea about future manpower planning. Even if you say that you want to launch IEP, it may not be feasible because we need the professional support. That's the crux of the problem, and you can't turn a blind eye to it. I'm sure they will tell us about the three-tier support or three-tier intervention system. Mr. Yang, maybe my colleagues can elaborate on the three-tier system. However, I just want to respond to the points made by Mr. Zhang and other members. When I first commented on the integrated education and the inclusive education, I wasn't trying to explain away why we weren't having inclusive education. I think we were sort of between the two. We are still at the stage of integrated education, but we're moving towards inclusive education. So we are not sort of staying put. We are not dismissing inclusive education as something not good. As Mr. Zhang has said, inclusive education means an inclusive society. For an inclusive society, we have to respect people of different age bands, people of different genders, etc., and people of different races. Of course, the society has to accept the SEN students, and in fact, everybody has to adjust themselves to fit into a society. So for integrated education, the student himself or herself has to make certain adjustments to fit into the school campus. But of course, we are not saying that we are asking the SEN student to adjust their physical strength, which is something impossible. I think the psychological aspect is feasible. For integrated education and inclusive education, to me, I think that we are moving towards inclusive education. We are not being stubborn in insisting on integrated education and expecting the SEN student to adjust themselves to the mainstream schools. We are trying to make sure that SEN students can sort of learn in a integrated education school. Of course, we are still some way from inclusive education. I must admit it. As Mr. Tam has said, what is important is to have the right attitude and the determination to progress. Parental engagement. Yes, I do agree that it should be enhanced. Whether it should be by way of legislation, well, I think in principle, greater parental engagement is good. Resources. I don't think we can resolve the problem of resources merely by legislation. Whenever resources are available, we're willing to put in more resources. When there isn't enough to go by, even there is a piece of legislation, we can't do it, and it won't be good by having legislation but not having any resources to back it up. Well, of course, some people may have the mindset that without legislation they won't do anything, but despite the absence of legislation, we can see that teachers and principals in schools have been taking a greater and greater part in such work, and let's wait and see how it goes. I won't rule out the possibility that one day we may find ourselves having to pass legislation so as to achieve more. But at this stage, we believe that with limited resources, it's better for us to put the resources on the students rather than dwelling on having a piece of legislation or not. But maybe Ms. Lee can elaborate on the point about IEP. Yes, Ms. Lee. For the point made by Mr. Cheung, that is how we define the level of support needed by an ASEAN student in the three-tier intervention model. Well, in fact, we have the response to intervention concept. Well, in the US, they are having the same concept. In the three-tier intervention mechanism, in a larger class, we help teachers to enhance the environment of the class. For those requiring additional support, they will go to the second tier. It may take place within the class, or it may be something like after class. If ASEAN students still have significant difficulties and persistent difficulties, then they will move on to the third tier with IEP. Mr. Cheung asked a very good question, that is whether we have objective criteria to find out who requires such a tier of support.
Let me give you a specific example. We don't just look at the categorization of the students, because that is not a professional judgment. We have a student support group with expert co-workers like psychologists to help us. Sometimes we even invite parents to participate in the assessment of the need of support of the students. Say for students with reading and writing difficulties, we now have a tiered support mode or approach adopted in 2005. With support from the Jockey Club, we've developed a framework, some teaching and learning materials, as well as assessment tools for teachers. For the assessment tools, they've now evolved into electronic forms. With electronic support, ASEAN students can receive timely assessment at intervals of once every 6 months, so that we know the progress of the student and what future learning needs and learning support the student needs. And in that process, there are objective data for us to analyze and judge whether or not a student needs Tier 1 support, Tier 2 support, or Tier 3 support, which is very much individualized. So this is a systematic approach to assess the tier of support that the student requires. So we do have expert judgment in the whole process. Thank you, Ms. Lee. Perhaps we should move on to the next item on the agenda, which is similar to the first discussion topic. Mr. Leung Yiu-chung, I'd like to seek some clarifications. You're not heading towards inclusive education. Integrated education is just a subset of inclusive education. Inclusive education is the big set. So you have to admit that the subset, integrated education, is really too small when compared with the set inclusive education. So inclusive education is really the big set, covering a lot of aspects: parental engagement, participation of schools, school sponsors, government, and so forth. So in Hong Kong, the subset of integrated education is really too small and not adequate. Yes, your direction is not incorrect, but you're doing too little. Well, the Undersecretary did say that they're heading towards inclusive education. I hope so. But of course, the question is how much time they'll take. It's just like universal suffrage. It's so distant from us. When will we be able to attain that? As Ms. Chung said, assessment of learning difficulties is relatively more mature in Hong Kong. But for other aspects, we may not have a comprehensive system for assessing SEN students. Mr. Leung Yiu-chung, well, you can continue to speak. Concerning assessment, parents and students only get a very simple one-page assessment report. That is not helpful for examinations, and then it's very costly to obtain that page of assessment report. Sometimes they may not even be able to obtain a report. So can the detailed assessment report be made available to the parents? Well, Dr. Hyun mentioned legislation. Oh, no, I'm not yet on legislation. I'm asking for the full report for the parents. Undersecretary, well, we touched upon this issue previously. Under the Personal Data Privacy Ordinance, parents absolutely have methods and rights to obtain the full assessment report. Subvented psychological assessment reports are very cheap. Under the Education Bureau, parents only need to fill out application forms and will have a performance pledge. That is, within a few weeks, the report will be made available to the parents. We'll charge a photocopying fee, $1.1 per page. So if it is 5 pages, then $5.5. I believe the majority of parents can afford that. On various occasions, we told parents that they're entitled to obtain the full assessment report, and we're very willing to make the arrangements. Do they have to lodge an application? Can you simplify the procedures? They don't need to apply, I think. Well, some parents told us that they don't need the assessment report. So we're of the view that a more appropriate approach is to let parents know what they're getting, so there must be an appropriate workflow. Well, this subject is worthy of our deliberation. But for individual education plans and concerning legislation on the part of other jurisdictions, transparency of information flow is very important. Maybe we should go back to the broad issue first. We can follow up later. We've invited experts and users to attend this part of the meeting to assist us with our discussion of individual education plans. First of all, I should welcome the 5 deputations and individuals. But I have to inform them that they're not protected by the Electoral Powers and Privileges Ordinance, so you are personally responsible for your remarks. In front of you, you have a list of security measures adopted for the meeting. This is something new. I'll invite the deputations and individuals to speak first, and then it will be the turn for the Undersecretary to respond, and then members' question time. All right, so 5 minutes per deputation or individual is a bit difficult. Today, we have quite some time for this topic. Well, Undersecretary, perhaps you can respond to those remarks related to IEP. You have already provided us with a paper. I think your position is quite clear. So we'll let the deputations first. First of all, Mr. Lee. Lee Chi-yong. IGP is adopted by my daughter's school. My daughter is an ASEAN student. So everything related to the child is focused on that document in order to benefit the student most. What's included in the plan? Parental engagement. The school always encourages parents to participate in the IGP. So every time we review the learning situation, characteristics, and special needs of the student, the parents are also informed of special areas of concern, differentiation of living habits and learning habits and so forth in order to design a curriculum that suits the student most. Ever since we participate in IGP, we obviously see that very fine-tuning had been done for the student. Facial expressions, ways of expression, emotional changes, cognitive performances, etc. have improved tremendously. Take my daughter as an example. Last year, her IGP was a 3-year plan. In the plan, we know what targets had been set for my student. And then in every stage, learning activities are designed to suit the needs of my daughter. At the moment, my daughter needs to learn vocabulary related to the home, society, school, and so forth. She has to learn certain terms. And there are specific targets for cognition and expression. My daughter can look at a particular object and then learn about that object. For example, an orange is size, weight, and taste. For example, it's sour or sweet, etc., etc. Well, people always think that people with severe learning difficulties are very different. But in the IGP, we're able to gauge the progress of the student. And my daughter has improved much throughout that process. Under certain circumstances, some behavior are observed by the school but not by the household, the family. For example, we have ways and means to quiet the student and to guide the student to focus on certain objects in the learning environment. Well, let me mention something more substantial. My daughter learned to communicate with other individuals, to control her sentiments and emotions, and so forth. My daughter has been studying for 6 to 7 years. Originally, she could only make simple expressions. Now, she can effectively tell us what she wants, for example, by showing her feelings and make drawings to indicate her needs, her conditions, and so forth. For example, she is taking a learning program. If she wants to respond, she can press the responsive button, choose drawings, or chooses to respond by sound. She can tell us when she's hungry, when she wants to sleep. And she has improved in taking care of herself. Thank you, Mr. Lee. You've shared with us your personal experience. I understand that your daughter is studying in a special school. So the IGP or IEP is different from that in a mainstream school. But absolutely, your sharing is of value to us. Next, Dr. Vicky Zhang. Mr. Chairman, I'm responding to your papers 586, bracket 01 and bracket 02. I think we should not just confine us to Tier 3 students. In your bracket 02 paper, you point out that for this three-tier approach, Tier 1 is to enhance the school classroom, to enhance the whole class. And Tier 2 is to have remedial support, mainly in the form of groups. Tier 3 is to provide individual education plans by way of counseling or one-to-one learning processes. So for students with severe learning difficulties, they will go to Tier 3. But that cannot comprehensively indicate the spirit of IEP. In other jurisdictions, procedures, measures, and plans are covered by one single document.
Well, for one-to-one teaching and learning, it is not confined to Tier 3 students. It is but one of the many different approaches in teaching. In fact, it is supplementary to response to intervention. For those who haven't been confirmed to require special educational needs or special support, but only regarded as poorer performers, they should still be given Tier 1 support. And then we'll just look at the response to Tier 1 support to decide whether Tier 2 or Tier 3 is required. For the RTI approach, since it will take time to enable teacher identification, professional assessment, and confirmation by doctors, so students have been made to wait for a long time and they don't get timely support and they have been wasting their time. In paragraph 12 of the paper, it says that the ED would only require the schools to prepare a support record for the students, but then records are only retrospective, and regular inspection or examination would only mean that it is only when the problem gets worse and then there will be remedial work. This is against the visionary approach of the RTI. Does it mean that a student has to wait for the impairment to worsen to Tier 3 before he can get any specialized help? Well, in fact, IEP and RTI are based on the same philosophy, and IEP can better provide response to intervention support. Therefore, we don't have to confine IEP to the Tier 3 SEN students only. Well, I think this is like in a construction project. We need a blueprint so that everybody can base on the blueprint to carry out the work. So an IEP is like a building plan so that the entire teaching team can follow the plan and follow the blueprint. IEP is necessary. With an IEP, it means that a teacher is building a house without a blueprint, without a building plan. The house cannot be built. Currently, for mainstream schools, if they want to have IEP, they can only make reference to what is mentioned in paragraph 10 of paper 02. That is the operation guide on whole school approach to IE. But then we haven't got clear guidelines, and therefore schools are at a loss as to how to do it. In paragraph 11 of the paper, it has talked about the current problems identified. Say a single IEP for the entire class. Teachers have to waste time on the cumbersome procedures of an IEP. It shows that they find it very difficult to carry out the work. It is discouraging. And if teachers have clearer and more detailed code of practice for IEPs and a piece of legislation, then they can better implement the idea of an IEP in the mainstream schools in Hong Kong. It will be better. When compared with other countries, Hong Kong is very different. Other places have already got detailed guidelines for IEP, and in fact, they have already plugged the loopholes in such a system. I think I understand that there are many dedicated principals and teachers. They're dedicated, but they don't know how to do it, how to help SEN students. And I think that IEP can provide a framework for teaching so that teachers and principals can be given guidance as to how to help the SEN students. Therefore, we must legislate for IEP, and during the drafting stage, we have to be very cautious and we have to come up with very detailed code of practice, and we must train the teachers and principals in acquiring the necessary skills. Thank you, Dr. Zhang. You addressed the issue from the angle of a educational professional. Next, Ms. Zheng. I'm a parent of an autistic child. My child has a normal intellectual ability. My child is very stubborn, and my child has difficulties in concentration. My child cannot focus easily in classroom, very impulsive, difficult to think in terms of others' feelings, and the child would rather go to the back of the classroom, read books, and find it difficult to listen to the teachers. My child won't do the classwork, and rules and regulations are not followed, failed to stand up, failed to raise a hand. If my child is shown the rules and regulations, my child would just leave the classroom, leave the school. As a result of such a personality, a lot of quarrels broke out between the classmates and my child, and then my child doesn't have many friends. that started in P3. Now my child is in P5. My child studied at 2 different primary schools. The second one is a privately run special school for autistic children. My child has normal intellectual ability. Now for the first school, my child attended the school for first 3 years. It was very good school, but then the school principal was replaced, and so we had to go to another school. Usually my child would be given additional attention, and many teachers were willing to give my child additional care. And then during a particular year, my child attended a class made up of 6 students only, and homework was reduced in terms of the quantity, and during assessment sessions, my child was given 5 additional minutes, and then every month my child got speech therapy, and every year my child would get a few sessions concerning social skills. So I think this is very important. Otherwise, it will become a major problem. For autistic children, you require special skills. You have to motivate them so that they can learn to learn, because it is impossible to have somebody accompanying an autistic child in a classroom all the time. And then behavioral issues should also be addressed. And then social skills, if there are only 15 minutes per week and led by a social worker, then for such an IEP, then it means that it is inadequate. My child went to a second school, and it was even worse. And I would skip that part. I would rather focus on the current school that my child is attending. It's a special one, and my child has been studying for 1.5 years. There is an IEP, and then the strengths and the weakness were identified, being impulsive, lack of attention. So for the first 3 months, that would be the focus. My child was asked to stay in her seat, and then the duration would increase gradually. And then for the autistic children, behavioral skills, speech and communicative skills, social skills, learn-to-learn skills, self-management and independent skills were all emphasized, and it's very specific for social skills. They learn how to read the signs, they learn how to go shopping. Learn-to-learn skills, they have to understand how to repeat what other students are doing. My time is up. I just want to say that for such IEPs, it isn't a matter of just writing it up within a short period of time. You need a high manpower ratio. In this school, it is 1:2, and then teachers have got intensive pre-service training running for a few months, and some teachers have had more than 15 years training with clinical psychology input. In the past, there was one EP for 8 schools. I also attended parent meetings, but then seldom did I get to see the EP. Even if I tried to talk about the needs of my son, but then the request was dismissed, and it was the final decision saying that since that wasn't arranged in the past, so we would not get it. And then we have very good peer support among parents. For the previous school, parents found it difficult to make known their requests. They were afraid that the schools would try to sort of retaliate. And at the end of the day, the parents just take away their children. You need to come to your conclusion. Yes, 10 seconds. Just now, we were told about assessment of the needs of the children. When my son was at P1, I asked how the assessment for support was carried out. I was told that there was a school support team and there was the EP. I would like to know whether they had an objective checklist to find out when and how the support would be boosted and removed. Next, Mr. Yong Ka-kui from the Special Education Society of Hong Kong. Yes, I would like to speak on behalf of the Special Education Society of Hong Kong. For our society, as far as this topic is concerned, I think all over the world we have differences concerning the definition. Let's not dwell on the variations, but briefly speaking, IEP is a commonly seen term in the literature. So for IEP, it means that it is comprehensive. It is for the purpose of planning for the learning of the SEN students, and it is a plan. Parental engagement is a must, and then it is of great details. It covers different subjects. For those physically handicapped, we'll try to see what will happen during the physical education lessons, and we'll try to cover different scenarios. So a comprehensive IUP can cover a lot of things. And then for the literature analysis, earlier this morning we were not able to come into the conference room, but then we were watching the proceedings while we were in the waiting room. We knew about the analysis carried out by the Legislative Secretariat. In 1994, mainland China also passed the legislation.
Macau legislated in 1996 to the effect that each SEN student should have an IEP. So it is worthwhile for the Bureau to look into that. Why is it that our neighboring jurisdictions have legislated on this issue? From the paper provided by the Bureau this time, apparently the Bureau has downgraded the merits of an IEP. With an IEP and legislation, teacher training and parental engagement will be involved, and efforts on the part of schools, teachers, and parents will be enhanced. So there are merits to an IEP. Just now, parents' representatives here have presented to you the merits of an IEP and legislation. I've set out 10 odd merits in my submission. There will be sufficient support for the students with legislation IEP. In Taiwan, the teachers involved have to take a training course of at least 2 credit points. And that's also the result of legislation. So it can be seen that without legislative regulation, it's very difficult for you to put forth requirements. It will also be difficult for you to require schools to produce IEPs. The present mechanism in Hong Kong is unfair. I've gone through the curricula of the tertiary institutions in Hong Kong. None of them offers a comprehensive IEP training program. So in terms of training, you should consider the merits of legislation that will benefit teacher training. And if you adopt a commercial point of view, you see that we have a trade description ordinance on punitive measures for misrepresentation. But in our regulatory regime, there's nothing for us to rely on to pursue false claims or misrepresentation. So, through IEPs, parents will be engaged in a contract such that parents can understand more about the planning of education by schools. The deputations here have submitted written comments to you. Dr. Zhang drew an analogy, that is construction of buildings. But here I'd like to give you another analogy. That is, you need to draw up travel plans before you travel. So this IEP is just like a travel plan. If you have such a plan, all stakeholders will know what to do. For parents, I can conclude that in Hong Kong, where a school has serious IEPs, parents' responses have been very positive. Through the whole process of IEP formulation, parents will be able to know more about the progress of their children, as mentioned by Mr. Lee. Originally, these parents were very frustrated and disappointed. But as a result of IEPs, they've been able to help their children. And many parents have, as a result, adjusted their frustration and disappointment and have been able to assist their children. I think you need to conclude. Well, I'll try. We have put forth comments in our submission. Oh, yes, we've received your submission. It's difficult to implement IEPs because if you are to adopt a stringent approach, then, as mentioned in our submission, 10 odd measures have to be adopted. For those schools who have adopted the IEP approach, they're very brave. They know the difficulties. Still, they implemented the approach. So for the Education Bureau, in future, even before legislation, the whole IEP process should be made more transparent and more resources should be given to that regard, and resources and posts should be readjusted for the smooth implementation of IEPs. And then in terms of knowledge, parental engagement, and so forth, we'll be able to see improvement and progress as a result of IEPs. Students cannot wait. Just now, Mr. Young, the Undersecretary, said that he would like to get everything ready before proceeding to legislation. I don't quite agree with him. Children's learning cannot wait. Well, I think you have to stop here. You still have further chances to speak. Well, I think you have to do justice to the parents. You have to focus on children's learning. It's just like the leaflets of travel agencies. They have to set all details in clarity. Finally, Ms. Ada Ho, the principal of Buddhist Po Kwang School. Our school is in the new territories. We are a special school serving students with a light and medium degree of learning disabilities. And we provide classes up to secondary 6. We have about 280 students. We're supporting the mainstream schools in our district by supporting SEN students. Let me supplement the remarks of KK. He drew the analogy of travel agencies. The leaflets have to be very clear with the details. All the tourist attractions should be set out in the leaflets. An individual education plan, that is the IEP, should attach importance to parental engagement as well as the integration of the professional team. Classroom adjustments, etc., involve different professions. Now, so many services are involved. Is there any integration in Hong Kong? What about the relevant stakeholders? For example, the parents. Do they have a high degree of participation? Do they have a strong say in the whole process, etc., etc.? Due to time constraint, I'll divide my remarks into two portions. First of all, what process we had gone through, and secondly, my individual observation of special schools. What problems have I observed? For our school, we're mainly responding to a report on special education compiled by the government 10 years ago. And one recommendation resulting from that review was IEP. I've been working on this for 10 years. That is, since 2005. And it's only now that in our school, each and every student gets an IEP. Well, the Education Bureau might have just produced a term, an expression, and then schools were left to grope their way through on their own. Just recently, some parents told me that there are certain aspects in the IEP, but those aspects had not been done, maybe even by the end of June. Now, I won't dwell on individual cases. What I would like to say is that special schools are under huge constraints as well. What is the biggest constraint? That is, what are the requirements put on special schools? We're groping our way through. What about the contents of the plan? What about information? Honestly speaking, in the initial stage, the teachers resented IEPs. IEPs are for individuals. Well, for a light degree of learning disability, if there are just 20 students in a class, it will be impossible for teachers to draw up IEPs for 20 individual students. So we need a framework. What happens in special schools now? what I observed was that there was a diversity of IEPs, and they left to develop on their own. We now have this IEP concept, but as KK said, what did the Hong Kong IED do in terms of teacher training? What sort of integration and coordination done by the Education Bureau? How are parents to assess the outcome, whether or not targets are met? So we need coordination, we need clear guidelines, we need research. In the past 10 years, my feeling was that we've only come up with terminology. But we did not do detailed planning and research on IEPs. Precisely because of this, I believe legislation is very important. Well, with legislation, we may not necessarily ask for a great deal of resources, but then with legislation, we may have more consensus among ourselves. Thank you very much, Ms. Ho, and thank you all deputations and individuals for sharing your experience and opinion with us. Perhaps I should invite Mr. Young, the Under-Secretary, to respond first. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've heard the deputations and individuals just now. 2 parents mentioned their experience, and we did hear school principals and experts. Perhaps I should clarify a couple of points. Mr. Yong said that I said that we would like to get everything ready before we legislate. I have to say that we're not sitting back and doing nothing. We're not putting students' interests last. It's precisely because we would like to take care of students wholeheartedly. We would like to place all available resources on the students first before legislating. Well, I differ from the deputations and individuals on this point. Dr. Zhang mentioned paragraph 11 of our paper, but that's about other jurisdictions, not about Hong Kong. As the school principal said, Ms. Ho said, even after 10 years, she's still exploring what special schools should do. I believe that's also a worthwhile point of reflection within the Bureau. If our colleagues have been implementing something for 10 years, but still do not know certain aspects, then we really have to visit schools to see what problems have emerged from IEPs. Schools can approach our colleagues for assistance. All along, we've been providing professional support to schools. So we're willing to send our colleagues to schools to see what assistance we can offer. And there's another difficulty. You said that after IEPs have been implemented for so long, you still don't know what to do and what's happening. Then how can we proceed to legislation? Because if we are to legislate, we must know what each and every party is doing. Anyway, after listening to the deputations and individuals, I am of the view that we fully agree that IEPs are worthwhile. From my standpoint, we should serve whoever is in need, but IEPs may not be necessary for each and every SEN student because a lot of resources will be required for the implementation of IEPs. Even if you refer to the UK and the US, they're also formulating IEPs only for those students with severe learning disabilities. I really don't know what they mean by students with continuous needs. I don't know whether they have a 3-tier system as well. Anyway, I have to look into the details before I can understand fully the differences between those jurisdictions and Hong Kong.
We have to spend resources to drop the plan. On the other hand, there is this school of thought that perhaps even without an IEP, we can still make use of the resources to help the SEN students. We are aware of the individual needs of the SEN students. This is being done in special schools and also for Tier 3 support. Paying attention to the individual needs is also important. For SEN students with less severe difficulties, maybe IEP is not necessarily required. I'm at your disposal as to whether you want me to elaborate further or whether you would like to have a discussion with the deputations. We have got about 26 minutes to finish the meeting. I think there is this consensus that is parental participation is important. There are 5 major principles under integrated education, namely home-school cooperation. This element is also included. So there's no disagreement. But then without an IEP, how can we allow the parents to play a role? So how can we make sure that when we launch integrated education, we can make sure that the parents can play a part? And then according to Ms. Lee, even for IEPs, parents may not always have a role to play. The parents may not always be allowed to have input. So when an IEP is drawn up, I want to know whether parents can take part in a meeting. The Undersecretary a moment ago told us, and according to the deputations, even when IEP is implemented, I think it is not uniform. The content of the IEP, the coverage of the IEP, and the communication among parents, EP, and teachers. Maybe the EP would only meet the student once or at most twice a year. So when it comes to the implementation details, if we haven't got any detailed guidelines, as pointed out by Dr. Zhang, if we do not have detailed guidelines, if we do not have specific requirements, then since we have got so low a percentage of SEN students having IEP, my understanding is that only about 5% of the SEN students among the 30,000 have got an IEP, so accounting for a very small percentage. Even if they do get one, the variety, the coverage are very different, and parents' role is not guaranteed. As pointed out by Ms. Zhang, a parent may very well come up with a suggestion, but then the professional may dismiss it by saying that the resources are not available. Maybe Ms. Lee can give a reply to this point. Let me clarify one point. Designing and examining and implementing the IEP would require the participation of parents. Our guides have made it clear as to the workflow of an IEP. For schools with IEP students, at least twice a year, there must be a conference for the IEP, and parents must be invited to take part in the conference. We do attach a lot of importance to homeschool cooperation. According to literature, whether legislation is in existence for IEPs, we are told that the learning outcomes are very different. There is no guarantee, but then parent participation is important. So I want to emphasize that for IEP, it doesn't mean that the colleagues in the team of a school will try to do something to change the student. No, that's not the case. It's a matter of making changes, making adaptations to the facilities of the school as well as the culture. So we need the resources, and parents have to tie in with the efforts to provide support at home. So parental participation is indeed important, and according to our guide, we do have very clear guidelines. We do require parental engagement or support. Just now, we have been asked as to whether the IEP has got requirements concerning the framework and other details. We do have a template, and we do make it clear as to what is and what should be included. We expect the school to examine the strengths and weaknesses of the student, and then we need to look at the support needs of the student, and then we come up with the long-term support goals and the short-term support goals. And then for the students' development, we try to see what the school has to do. It has to be specific, and we have to come up with assessment mechanisms and benchmarks. I understand that the majority of the schools do invite parents to take part in the drawing up of the plan as well as regular reviews. After the plan has been drawn up, the relevant stakeholders will sign to confirm, to say that the blueprint has the agreement of all. And then for the review, stakeholders are expected to be frank in exchanging the views. Ms. Zhang told us about the case of her son. I think maybe a few years ago, our professional support wasn't that substantial, but my understanding is that since we are developing school-based educational psychology, we have got more and more educational psychologists going to public sector schools. You talked about meeting the EP only infrequently. I think that's no longer the case. Nowadays, they visit the school at least once every 2 weeks. The majority of the schools, in accordance with the needs of the students and the needs of the parents, educational psychologists will be meeting with the children to see whether the IEP has to be amended. And then we'll also find out whether we need a stronger support or more input from the EP. Colleagues, any questions? As to the experience outlined by Ms. Lee, well, my daughter used to study at a special school. Of course, there's a special school for severely handicapped children. They were supposed to have IEPs for everybody. And then Ms. Lee said that parental engagement would be necessary, but my experience is not. For the IEP conference, I think there is a quota for parents' attendance because they are limited in resources. So only a small number of cases will see parental input. And so in most of the time, we didn't get to join the others at the conference. We had to take the initiative to request for our attendance. I just want to say that the variation is huge. Yes, you do have a guide and you have guidelines. Now, there's no way for you to tell whether schools are following the guidelines, and you can't do anything about it, even if you know that they are not following the guidelines. Schools do face a difficulty. They don't have the manpower. Now, for IEP to be made mandatory for everybody, then it will be a heavy workload. As Principal Ho has said, even for schools with IEPs, the variation is huge, and there are still many inadequacies. The office may think that you have issued the guidelines, schools have them, and you think that the world is perfect. But I can tell you that the real world doesn't operate in this way. The reality is a far cry from it. Dr. Chen, 4 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, deputations and individuals for coming to this meeting. We have got professionals who are very experienced in this field, and grateful to you for sharing your observation with us. I think the discussion was very abstract. It seems that we were talking about something most philosophical, that is whether we should emphasize the individual or whether the collective, that is whether we should have integrated education or inclusive education. So it seems that we were having something metaphysical. And then there was this discussion as to whether legislation would just result in formalities. And now in this session, we are told that despite the existence of guidelines, we haven't got any standards. So it seems that the conclusion is that despite having legislation, the outcome will still not be desirable. I'm not doubting the motive of the administration. I think we all have good intentions. We have also always given priority to the well-being of the children. Now, what I want to say is that, yes, there are guidelines, but then the guidelines are better than nothing, not having anything. Now, if we are afraid that they will degenerate into formalities only, then we should try to address these specific questions. Now, Mr. Yang was saying that we were still approaching the right direction in a broad sense. You said that you have reservation about legislation. You have asked us to wait for other things to be in place first before we talk about legislation. So what actually do you mean? I want to have something more concrete. I've listened to the speakers, and I think I need to back this question. We have to take ICP as a very serious matter.
When we consider the welfare of SEN students, when we consider parental engagement, if we all agree that we should head towards the same direction, then we should start. By way of our discussions on legislation, we can handle what had been discovered in the past. It doesn't matter what problems we have up to this moment. We are all committed to heading towards the same goal, that is legislation. In the past, we mentioned legislating for the sake of legislating. But now, we consider legislation to be our ultimate goal, our common goal. So let's head towards that goal in a concerted effort. schools, school principals, parents, government, etc., all want to head towards that goal. And in other jurisdictions, we can see that legislation had been adopted as their approach. Still, we have to research into the subject to see how that will benefit ASEAN students. Then by way of legislation, when we go through that process, we'll handle the problems that we've experienced. Then we can avoid formalism. Even in university, when I discuss with my students, we won't say that, oh, throughout the whole world there is formalism, so we should all stand still and do nothing. The Undersecretary gave me the impression that we should all stay put without doing anything. So we should join hands in a concerted effort to take that first step. Undersecretary, are you stay put? Or are you standing still or sitting back without doing anything? No. Well, in fact, I'm not eloquent. I'm not good at speaking. I've always been messy in my remarks. Here in LegCo, I'd always like to be simple and brief. At the moment, I consider that there are too many things not done, so we're not yet on legislation. Dr. Chan asked whether we can prepare for legislation. There are a lot of things that we can do. When we are prepared, we can proceed to legislation. Frankly speaking, I've not considered that yet. Well, in between, there are a lot of things to be done. We can help with the implementation of integrated education. I don't see any fundamental conflicts between integrated education and inclusive education. Honestly speaking, I haven't thought about this. I can go back and think about it. If my colleagues have time, honestly speaking, I'd like them to overcome the past difficulties and hurdles first. Well, diversification is not bad, but problems are not good. In future, legislation may help. I don't see any direct conflict between your remarks and our standpoint, but at this juncture, I won't say that legislation is our ultimate goal. Of course, after doing everything, we still cannot solve the problems, and we may consider legislation. Well, Mr. Chairman, it's just like reclamation. All along, we've been urging the government to present us with a vision. Then we can work out the details. It will be easier. But now, it's just like you have 10 pots, but only 2 lids. I understand what you're talking about. You're actually saying that you have 10 pots, but only 2 lids. So, you can never have all the 10 pots covered. That has been happening in the past 10 years, so you're heading nowhere. Well, we focus on children's interest. Is legislation the only solution? Up to this moment, I cannot agree with you. There's no difference between you and me. The difference is that you want legislation, but I don't think legislation is the only way out at this juncture. Now we've heard our colleagues who have pointed out certain problems. Our colleagues in the research division also carried out a study on other jurisdictions. And we now understand the differences between legislation and non-legislation. If you don't legislate, if the government doesn't want to legislate, LegCo members cannot legislate. We all understand the present difficulties. LegCo members cannot take initiatives to legislate. What about parental engagement, imbalance of powers, reality, differing from your guidelines, unbalanced participation, and so forth. So what will you do? Mr. Chairman, in the past, when we participated in integrated education, we discovered that when we would like to design something, the reality might differ from the objectives of our products. Well, we had parental feedback. Probably we need to do more monitoring. We would like to have consistency between reality and the designed programs. Maybe I should defer to Mr. Mui for the monitoring system and see whether or not we'll enhance monitoring in future. Mr. Mui? Let me say something about the present regulatory system. Through the responsibility system, schools have to continuously review the support measures for SEN students and then explain and be held accountable to the stakeholders. We, in clear terms, require schools to submit interim annual reports to us. Now, when schools fill out the interim annual report, they have to assess the situation of each and every student before they can complete the mid-year report. And then in terms of transparency, we also require schools to list out in their annual reports how resources are mobilized to support SEN students. As for our regular work, our professional colleagues will visit schools annually to monitor and support schools, normally at intervals of 2 to 4 visits per year. At the beginning of the school year, in terms of monitoring and support, we'll look at the overall support plans of the schools, the conditions of newly enrolled students, what their conditions are, and what categories of SEN students they have enrolled, how resources are mobilized, how the study grants are used, how they can meet the different needs of different types of SEN students. And for hardware, supposing they have students with hearing impairment, we'll see whether or not their wireless tuning systems are well equipped, particularly for P1 and S1 students. So under all these systems, we're monitoring schools annually. As for teacher training, at the end of each school year, they will write to the schools to set out the training positions and then take into consideration the enrollment profile of a school for each year. We'll see whether or not corresponding courses should be provided. So we have regular follow-up actions. Well, that's quite comprehensive. Now, what about this mid-year report? Can parents access the report? Do you have transparency here? Well, we've not uploaded the report to the website, but in parent-teacher associations, they can ask for such reports. As for the annual reports from schools, for measures adopted by schools, how resources are mobilized to support SEN students. All these have to be set out in the annual report, and that annual report is uploaded to the website. As far as this report is concerned, the descriptions are rather brief. Learning resources will be mobilized in employing teaching assistants, etc., etc. Now you have the report, and every year colleagues from the Education Bureau will visit each school twice or 4 times a year for the purpose of monitoring. But we discovered that 40 to 50 schools have enhanced resources, but those enhanced resources have not been used to the full, and the surplus was even plowed back to you. 40-odd schools underspent and plowed back the resources to you. I don't understand why that has happened. Let me explain a little bit on this. In the past, for subvented schools, when the learning support grant was given to the school can keep all the surpluses. But the habit of many schools is to save up a small sum of money year by year, say 5%. Starting from 2003-04 for primary schools, we already got this OSG. And every year, the schools have been saving quite huge sums of money. Our colleagues, when visiting schools, will remind schools to use up their resources as far as possible. So in accordance with needs and students' conditions, schools should be using the money. For underspending, sometimes it can be a technical issue. And when a school employs teachers, originally the school may want the teacher to serve the school for a year, but that teacher may leave midway. Or originally the school plans to use $50,000 on a particular project, but after bidding, they spend only $30,000. Oh, I understand that there may be different reasons for underspending, but resources are precious. As resources have been allocated to these schools, we would like schools to make full use of them for the support of SEN students. The Undersecretary mentioned enhanced monitoring. I really want you to work hard on that, and you must have some plans. For monitoring and transparency, perhaps you should let parents understand fully the situation.
Many parents do not know where the resources have gone. Now, Mr. Mui has said that they have already told their parents. Is it because the information is incomplete? Ms. Cheung, I'll just give you 1 minute as well to run up the meeting. If I may respond to what has been said by the Bureau. I think there's something wrong with the parent complaint mechanism. I did complain to the Education Bureau concerning the educational needs, but then I was advised to take up the matter with the school. When I first found that the child was suffering from learning difficulties, I did not have much support. And then I had the advice of a particular group. And then other parents told me that I had to find out more. on my own. I think you don't have much parental training. It's only when parents are in the picture, then parents can know how to approach the schools, making suggestions concerning adjustments, and that we don't have to cry over unfinished homework. I did try to assist a parent in making a complaint. We called many numbers, and then a parent was persuaded by the school authority to take the child away. Ms. Zhang, yes, indeed, you have raised a very important point. Among the 5 principles, they have home school cooperation, but then again, it is also supposed to be school-based. So if it is a matter of home school cooperation, and yet if it is school-based, then it will be difficult for grievance to be addressed. We don't have much time left. The subcommittee can only work until September this year. So we won't be having meetings beyond July. But we do plan to have a meeting to talk about the complaint mechanism. So perhaps we can leave it till then. I think we have to wind up our meeting now. Dr. Zhang, 1 minute. Mr. Young gave a reply, but then I can see a number of questions here. Mr. Young was saying that IEP was time-consuming. It's better to spend the time on the students. But if you haven't got an IEP and just spend time on the learning, and yet the quality of the teaching and learning doesn't suit the purpose, and if you cannot satisfy their needs, then it is useless. You also said that IEP would require a lot of resources, and therefore you won't be spending resources on IEP. I think it's a matter of whether it is worth it. If the resources spent on a building can meet the needs of the owner, then of course it's good. But then if you spend a lot of resources on building poor quality housing and it's not inhabitable, then it is not worth it. If I may just make a remark here, I'm not doubting the value of IEP. All along, I'm only saying that as to whether each and every SEN student should be given an IEP irrespective of the degree of disability or impairment. All right. We have to make preparations for legislation. Maybe you don't address it from this point of view, but I think you agree with me that there should be better monitoring in the light of what has been said by the deputations. Can you not go back and prepare a paper for us addressing the various problems that have been identified? Now, you don't favor legislation as the approach, but indeed there are many problems, and you have agreed that there should be better monitoring. So we have a monitoring mechanism, but how you're going to enhance it, please write a paper on this. Moreover, please give us more information. Say the number of students covered by IEP, the distribution of SEN students in the 3-tier system. And if every student is to get an IEP, what sort of difficulties do you foresee? Mr. Chairman, for the figures, yes, I can try to see what can be done. Enhancement of the monitoring system. I think we need to look at a host of other factors. So can you be more specific? Maybe we can sort of focus on enhancing the role of the parents. As you have pointed out, we have a monitoring mechanism in place. So perhaps we should find out how we can actually implement the mechanism within the framework. So it isn't a matter of coming back to you in a month's time and try to make suggestions as to how the mechanism can be enhanced. So I don't think I can come back to you that soon. But if you are more specific, say transparency, parental engagement, etc., I think we can try our best to address more specific issues. It doesn't matter, you just do your best. I understand that, yes, we do have a mechanism. We have an existing mechanism. And if we want to change it, we have to have thorough discussion in the first place. Parental role and transparency are important. I think you're duty-bound to tell us how you're going to make improvements in the two areas identified. Mr. Yong, just a brief word. Yes, be brief. Teacher training is a very important indicator. If we don't address this issue, you cannot expect schools to have the ability to deliver. For frontline colleagues, I think they're already doing their best, but then they're at a loss. They haven't got a direction. It seems that we haven't got an itinerary, we haven't got a building plan. Yes, thank you for pointing this out. Teacher training is important. For tertiary education, I think this sort of training is inadequate. Perhaps we haven't got the manpower, we haven't got the talents. So perhaps the Bureau has to think about this point. Other than more parental input, more transparency, what about accumulation of knowledge? What about publicity and also teacher training? What about accumulation of knowledge in the context of university? I think such issues have to be considered again. That's it for this item today. We're grateful to the deputations and individuals for coming. Of course, we're not able to come to a clear consensus with the administration, but they've told us that we share the same view in terms of the broad direction. They don't think the legislation is necessary. They don't think the IEP is necessary for each and every student with SEN. We cannot agree with them, but I think having considered our own views as well as the views of the public, eventually we will prepare a report, and then at the LegCo meeting we will try to present the report, hoping that we can get the recognition and agreement of the LegCo as a whole. From the month of May, we had scheduled a visit to have a look of the course for sign language, but then we have filibustering, and so we may not be able to make it. It was originally scheduled for the 2nd of May, so perhaps we need to change the date of the visit. The Secretariat is trying to reschedule it to sometime in the middle of May. We can only make it on the on Monday or Tuesday. They don't have classes on Saturday, but we are going to have meetings of the LegCo from Wednesday to Friday. So if we're able to pay the visit, then on the 22nd of May, when we have our meeting, we can talk about our experience of the visit. And then we need to talk about collaboration across disciplines and across various stakeholders like universities, teachers, schools, and parents. So we want to take up the two topics. The 28th of May, in fact, is a Wednesday in the morning. That's it for today. Thank you.